spoilers for all of Twin Peaks and Twin Peaks The Return. Let me tell you a story. It's a story of a man named Richard. Richard is an FBI agent. He lives in Odessa, Texas. He's pretty good at his job. No nonsense, works hard at what he does, and is well aware just how bad people can be. Richard has been an FBI man for most of his adult life. He started out with hopes and dreams about making the world better, but the reality of how cruel the world is has weighed him down over the years, making him cynical and hardened. Because of his dedication to his job, he's had a hard time with relationships and is estranged from his wife and son. The closest connection he's formed was an on-again, off-again relationship with a woman that has recently left him after years of being unable to connect with him. Her name is Linda. Richard is haunted by his past, haunted by the cases he simply can't get over, and one case in particular. Back when Richard was a young agent, there was a murder of a high school girl in Odessa named Laura Palmer. Richard was assigned to this case. Through his investigations, he found this young woman was heavy into self-medicating through various drugs while suffering abuses of all kinds through family members and members of her community until her death. Though Richard had his assumptions and suspects, no conclusive proof could be found to who murdered this young girl, and after a few months of work, he was assigned to another case. This young girl's murder was yet another cold case lost in paperwork, another senseless act of violence in a vicious world that we know so well. And Richard simply could not forget how unfair the world seemed to treat her. Her case pained and haunted Richard. He couldn't get her out of his head. He saw himself as an impotent law enforcer, jaded and unable to do his job. He saw his life as one with no real connections in an uncaring and unfeeling community. He saw a world that didn't make any sense, with no narrative guiding us, no great mystery, just a collection of meaningless acts, some good, some awful, that compile our tiny speck in the universe. And that is when Richard did a beautiful thing. He dreamt. And in dreaming, he escaped. And in the depth of his dreaming, he found an incredible place. Here he was no longer a beaten-down detective. No, here he was an amazing, upbeat, inspiring FBI agent with a name like Dale Cooper, which could happily sit aside Sherlock Holmes or Hercule Poirot as agents who always get their man. Richard only liked coffee, but not Dale. Dale loves coffee. Dale loves everything, and everybody loves Dale. He found a community full of incredibly interesting characters, some silly, some deceitful, full of intrigue and sleuthing he was assuming he would get when he joined the bureau. He created a community that loved Laura as much as he did, and as much as he wanted them to, and he was their knight in shining armor here to save the day. Yes, he and Linda had a distant relationship, but it was only because he was on assignment in this quirky small town. She was his trusty Watson in the form of Diane to cheer him on his most thrilling case. The reason Richard was haunted by this case was because it was so much bigger than just Laura's death. It was celestial, fantastical, full of pure evil and untapped dimensions to work through a cosmic plan, centering on the two most important people in Richard's life, Richard and Laura. Laura's father, who abused her, couldn't have just been an abusive, mentally ill man. How could any decent person ever do such an awful thing to their child? No, he was possessed by an ageless form of evil that made him do these things. Richard's lack of hard evidence towards a definite suspect in the case wasn't because of his inability as a young agent. No, it was because the clues were cryptic and turned upside down or reversed. While Richard felt like a cog in an unfeeling machine of government agency, Dale is loved and respected by his colleagues on the police force and in his agency. And Richard never became jaded and hateful and embittered by his years of a job that made him feel so incompetent and ineffective. No, that same evil being took him over and made him this uncaring person. The hopeful, idealistic agent who wants to help people is just trapped inside and needs to get out. When he tried to make a marriage work and have a child, even though he was distant and removed, it wasn't because of his trauma over the years of seeing the worst in humanity. No, it was because he exited a mysterious fantasy realm without defeating an evil form inhabiting him. The regrettable, hateful, and shady things that he had done that he regrets weren't him. It was an evil being possessing his body. And Richard wasn't unhealthily obsessed with Laura Palmer, things that he heard so many times. A case that had no deeper meaning or relevance, just a mindless, violent act. No, Laura is the one. Maybe one of the most important people in all of space and time. She was created by everything good and pure for that very reason. And Richard ended this tale exactly how his mind needed him to. He killed off the bad part of him that he'd rather not think about and destroyed the eternal evil that he knows dwells in each and every one of us. And Linda came back to him, always pining for him the way that he pined for her, needing to be rescued back into reality by him. But as Richard told this story to himself, his mind had a harder and harder time lying to him. He knew it wasn't real. He knew it was all a story for himself, and he knew in the end, he still couldn't do the one thing he really wanted to do. Richard wanted to save Laura. And Richard couldn't save Laura. Even Dale Cooper couldn't save Laura. Laura died, and Laura was gone. And if she lived, if none of this awfulness were to ever happen to her, she would just be another woman living in Odessa. She would probably have problems. She wasn't perfect. She was just a young kid, just trying to make her life work as a waitress at a little restaurant, and would have no idea who Richard was. And Richard could try to explain to her how important Laura was to him, how she kept him up at nights, how cosmic and radiant and significant she was, how he created an entire world just for her. But if he ever showed her that world, none of what Richard created would be there, because none of that world was real. It was an entire world he created using names and ideas and stories from his life to make the world make some kind of sense. And if that somehow could happen, I hope Laura would do the only act that really needed to be done. She would tell Richard to wake up. And you might think, so none of that was real? It was a huge waste of time? None of that mattered? Well, it mattered to Richard. And part of me thinks it mattered to Laura. And hopefully, it helped a man in his later years come to peace with some demons and some angels he just couldn't get out of his mind. But a guy can dream.